Elena Rodriguez had been invisible at Fort Bennett for 8 months, and that's exactly how she preferred it. Every morning at 5 a.m., she'd slip through the gates in her faded gray t-shirt and khaki pants, ponytail swaying as she walked to the shooting range. The guards barely looked up anymore. Just another civilian contractor doing the grunt work nobody else wanted. "Morning, logistics girl," Sergeant Marcus Webb would call out with a smirk, not bothering to learn her actual name. At 26, Elena had perfected the art of blending into the background while the real soldiers did their important work. She cleaned their equipment, sorted their ammunition, and organized their gear with methodical precision. But Elena carried secrets in her quiet movements. When she thought no one was watching, she'd run her fingers along rifle stocks with the familiarity of an old friend. She'd unconsciously adjust imaginary windage knobs when the desert breeze shifted. Her eyes would track the mirage patterns dancing above the heated range, and she'd wince when soldiers made basic marksmanship errors that would have earned her a lecture from her father. Luis Rodriguez had been a legend, Medal of Honor recipient, record-holding sniper, the kind of soldier other soldiers told stories about in hushed tones. He trained Elena from age 12 until his death in a training accident when she was 16. But that was a lifetime ago, and now she was just another face in the crowd, invisible and unremarkable. The first warning sign came on a Tuesday morning when she arrived to find Private Tommy Jackson struggling with a jammed M24. The bolt was stuck solid, and frustration was written all over his young face. Elena had seen this problem a dozen times before. A simple fix if you knew what you were doing. Need help? She offered quietly, setting down her cleaning supplies. Jackson looked up, surprised. "You know about rifles?" "A little." Elena's hands moved with practiced precision, field stripping the weapon in seconds. She cleared the jam, checked the firing pin, and reassembled everything with smooth efficiency. "There, should work fine now." Jackson stared at her with new respect. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Before Elena could answer, Sergeant Webb's voice cut through the morning air. "Rodriguez, what do you think you're doing?" Elena looked up to find Webb striding toward them, his face dark with irritation. "Just helping with a jam, Sergeant. Did I ask for your help?" Webb's voice carried the authority of someone who enjoyed wielding power over those beneath him. "You're logistics support. That means you clean, organize, and stay out of the way. You don't touch the weapons. But you were just overstepping your bounds." Webb's cold blue eyes fixed on her. "Do you even have a gunsmith license? Because if you don't, you have no business putting your hands on military hardware." Elena felt her cheeks burn. "No, Sergeant. I don't have a license." "Then stick to what you're qualified for." "Mop buckets over there." Webb turned to Jackson. "And you, next time you have a problem with your weapon, you bring it to me or one of the armorers. Not some civilian who thinks she knows better." As Webb walked away, Elena caught a glimpse of Lieutenant Carlos Ramirez watching from across the range. Unlike the others, he seemed to actually see her, not just as invisible. Logistics support, but as a person with thoughts and capabilities. Their eyes met for a moment before Elena looked away, focusing on her cleaning supplies. But Lieutenant Ramirez had noticed something in that brief interaction. Elena's movements hadn't been those of an amateur fumbling with unfamiliar equipment. Her hands had moved with the confidence of someone who'd handled weapons thousands of times. Someone who'd been trained by an expert. The thought nagged at him as he watched Elena return to her quiet routine, once again fading into the background. There was more to this woman than met the eye, and he was beginning to suspect that Fort Bennett was about to learn just how much. They'd underestimated the quiet girl in the gray t-shirt. That afternoon, as Elena methodically cleaned rifle scopes, she allowed herself a small smile. Let them think she was just another invisible civilian. She had her father's lessons to keep her company, 10 years of preparation burning quietly in her chest, and the patience to wait for the right moment to honor everything he taught her. She just hadn't expected that moment to come so soon. The mockery started small, but grew like a cancer. It began with whispered comments Elena pretended not to hear as she worked around the range. "Look at logistics girl playing with the big boys' toys." Private Danny Morrison would snicker to his buddies. "Maybe she thinks she's gonna be the next G.I. Jane." Sergeant Webb seemed to take particular pleasure in making Elena's life difficult. He'd assign her the most tedious tasks: cleaning cosmoline off ancient rifle parts, scrubbing brass until it gleamed, organizing ammunition by grain weight with obsessive precision. When she completed these tasks flawlessly, he'd find new ways to remind her of her place. "Rodriguez!" His voice would boom across the range. "Those scopes better be spotless. I don't want to see a single fingerprint." Then, when she'd finish polishing them to perfection, he'd run his finger across the lens just to leave a smudge. "Try again." But Elena endured it all with quiet dignity, her father's voice echoing in her memory. "Mia, excellence doesn't need an audience. Do your work right, whether anyone's watching or not." What Webb didn't know was that Elena was learning. Every morning, she arrived early and stayed late, absorbing every detail of the range operations. She studied the soldiers' techniques, noting their strengths and weaknesses. She recorded wind patterns, temperature variations, and atmospheric conditions in a worn notebook that never left her side. Lieutenant Ramirez began to notice her dedication. Unlike the others, he'd actually read Elena's personnel file. Civilian contractor, logistics support, excellent references from her previous job at a sporting goods store. But something didn't add up. No civilian contractor had this level of focus, this intense attention to detail. "Elena," he called out. One morning, after another brutal session with Webb, she looked up from where she was methodically cleaning bolt assemblies, her hands steady despite the sergeant's earlier tirade. "Yes, Lieutenant? You've been here 8 months. What made you apply for this position?" Elena considered her answer carefully. "I needed work, and I'm good with details." "That's not what I meant." Ramirez sat down across from her, his voice gentle but probing. "Most people would have quit after a week of Webb's treatment. Why do you stay?" Elena's hand stilled on the bolt she was cleaning. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, a depth of pain and purpose that caught Ramirez off guard. Then the mask slipped back into place. "I have my reasons, Lieutenant." Before Ramirez could probe further, Webb's voice cut through the air. "Rodriguez, stop socializing and get back to work. Those weapons won't clean themselves." But Ramirez had seen enough. That evening, he made a call to an old friend in personnel records. If Elena Rodriguez was hiding something, he was going to find out what. The answer came back the next morning, buried in a file that made his blood run cold. Elena Rodriguez, daughter of Master Sergeant Luis Rodriguez, Medal of Honor recipient, legendary Army sniper. The man who'd held the record for longest confirmed kill until 2017. The man who died in a training accident 11 years ago, leaving behind a 16-year-old daughter who'd vanished from military circles completely. Suddenly, everything made sense. The way Elena handled weapons with unconscious familiarity, her intense focus on range conditions, the pain he'd glimpsed in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. She wasn't just some civilian contractor. She was the daughter of a legend, carrying her father's legacy in silence. That afternoon, Webb's harassment reached a new level. He'd found a broken spotting scope and was berating Elena as if it were her fault. "This is what happens when civilians touch military equipment," he snarled, holding up the damaged scope. "You probably broke this trying to play soldier." Elena stood at attention, taking the abuse without a word. But Ramirez saw her hands clench. into fists at her sides, saw the muscle in her jaw twitch with suppressed emotion. "That scope was already damaged, Sergeant," she said quietly. "I documented it in my report 3 days ago." Webb's face darkened. "Are you calling me a liar, Rodriguez?" "No, Sergeant. I'm stating a fact." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Other soldiers had stopped their work to watch the confrontation, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Maybe it's time you learned your place," Webb said slowly. "From now on, you arrive at 4:30 a.m. instead of 5 o'clock, and you stay until everyone else is gone. Maybe some extra hours will teach you about respect." Elena nodded silently, but Ramirez saw something change in her expression. The quiet acceptance was still there, but underneath it, something harder was beginning to form. Her father's daughter was waking up, and Webb had no idea what storm he was about to unleash. That night, Elena sat in her small apartment, staring at a framed photo of her father in his dress uniform. His medal citations hung on the wall beside it: Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Silver Star, and the Congressional Medal of Honor that had made him a legend. "I'm trying to honor you the right way, Papa," she whispered to the photograph. "But I don't know how much longer I can stay invisible." She opened her notebook and began writing, recording not just atmospheric conditions, but everything she'd observed about the soldiers' techniques, their equipment, their attitudes. If they wanted to push her to her breaking point, they were going to discover that Luis Rodriguez had trained his daughter well. The quiet war at Fort Bed was about to become something much more dangerous. Colonel Kenneth Rhodes arrived at Fort Bed like a storm front, his reputation preceding him by a week of nervous preparations. The man who'd built his career on transforming mediocre units into elite forces was coming to evaluate the marksmanship program, and everyone knew heads would roll if they didn't measure up. Elena watched from the shadows as the base transformed itself. Equipment was polished to mirror brightness, uniforms pressed to razor sharpness, and Sergeant Webb's already harsh demeanor became absolutely brutal. The extra pressure he'd been applying to Elena doubled, then tripled. "Rhodes expects perfection," Webb snarled during a pre-dawn inspection of her work. "And if you embarrass me in front of him, I'll make sure you never work on another military installation again." Elena nodded silently, but inside, something was crystallizing. For 8 months, she'd endured the mockery, the dismissal, the casual cruelty. She'd told herself it was enough to honor her father's memory through quiet excellence. But as she watched Webb swagger on the range, puffing up his chest for the colonel's visit, she realized that silence could be its own form of cowardice. The breaking point came 2 days before Rhodes' arrival. Elena was performing her usual morning routine when she overheard a conversation that made her blood freeze. "I don't care if she's been here 8 months, Webb was telling Lieutenant Morrison. "During the colonel's visit, all non-essential personnel stay away from the firing line. That includes our little logistics princess." "But sir," Morrison replied, "she knows the range better than anyone. Her equipment maintenance has been flawless." Webb's laugh was harsh. "She's a civilian contractor with delusions of grandeur. The last thing we need is some wannabe soldier making us look bad in front of Rhodes. She can clean toilets while the real soldiers demonstrate proper marksmanship." Elena felt something inside her chest snap. Not break, snap, like a rifle, bolt sliding into place. For 8 months, she'd been the invisible woman, the helpful background figure who made everyone else look good. But she was Luis Rodriguez's daughter, and her father hadn't raised her to accept disrespect quietly. That afternoon, she made a decision that would change everything. Lieutenant Ramirez found her in the armory after hours, methodically disassembling and cleaning an M24 with movements so precise they looked like a meditation. She'd opened the weapon with the casual familiarity of someone who'd performed this task thousands of times. "Elena," he said quietly, "we need to talk." She looked up, and for the first time since he'd known her, she didn't immediately look away. "Yes, Lieutenant, I know who your father was." The words hung in the air between them. Elena's hands stilled on the rifle components, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Then you know why I can't just walk away." Ramirez sat down across from her. Luis Rodriguez was the finest marksman I ever heard of. His shot at Kandahar in 2003 saved 12 lives, including Colonel Rhodes. Elena's eyes widened. "Colonel Rhodes knew my father. Rhodes was a captain then. Your father made an impossible shot in a 40-mile-per-hour crosswind to take out a Taliban sniper who had Rhodes pinned down. The colonel never forgot that debt." Elena resumed her work on the rifle, but her movements had changed. There was purpose in them now, a sense of destiny approaching. "What are you suggesting, Lieutenant?" "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time Fort Bennett learned what Luis Rodriguez taught his daughter." Elena was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn silver dollar, its surface polished smooth by years of handling. "This was his," she said. "He used it to teach me about precision under pressure. Every shot has to count," he'd say, "because you never know when someone's life might depend on it." Ramirez studied the coin, understanding flooding through him. "The demonstration for Colonel Rhodes is tomorrow." "I know." Elena's voice was steady now, filled with quiet resolution. "And I think it's time the colonel learned that Luis Rodriguez's lessons didn't die with him." She reassembled the rifle with fluid precision, every movement economical and sure. When she was finished, she looked directly at Ramirez with eyes that reminded him of her father's legendary focus. "Lieutenant, I need to ask you a favor." "Name it." "Tomorrow, when they're struggling to impress the colonel, give me one chance. One shot. That's all I need." Ramirez felt a chill run down his spine. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers who were about to do something impossible. "Elena, if this goes wrong, it won't." She stood, cradling the rifle like an old friend. "My father spent 10 years preparing me for this moment. I just didn't know it until now." As she walked away, Ramirez realized that the quiet civilian contractor who'd been invisible for 8 months was about to become the most important person on the base. Tomorrow, Fort Bennett would discover that they'd been harboring a legend in disguise. And Sergeant Webb was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his career. The morning of Colonel Rhodes' demonstration arrived with the brutal clarity of Arizona heat. Elena stood at her bathroom mirror at 4 a.m., braiding her hair with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. Today felt different, like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that the next step would either be flight or freefall. She barely slept, her mind cycling through wind calculations and ballistic tables that her father had drilled into her memory. "Mental preparation is half the battle, Mia," his voice echoed in her thoughts. "When the moment comes, your body will know what to do if your mind is ready." At the base, the atmosphere was electric with nervous energy. Pentagon officials had arrived in black SUVs, their presence adding weight to every interaction. Defense contractors set up expensive equipment, their cameras positioned to capture what they hoped would be an impressive display of military precision. Elena arrived at her usual time, but instead of being directed to the range, she was stopped at the gate by military police officer Jake Morrison. "Sorry, Rodriguez," he said, not looking particularly sorry. "Classified training exercise today. All non-essential personnel restricted to administrative areas." Elena nodded politely, but Lieutenant Ramirez, who'd been waiting nearby, stepped forward. "She's with me, Morrison." Colonel's orders. It was a lie, but Morrison didn't question it. Ramirez led Elena to a position near the range where she could observe without interfering. She pulled out her worn notebook and began recording atmospheric conditions with the intensity of someone preparing for war. "Wind shifted since yesterday," she murmured, more to herself than to Ramirez. "Southwest at 8 miles per hour, gusting to 12. Temperature inversions starting to form. That'll affect trajectory at long range." Ramirez watched her work, marveling at the transformation. This wasn't the quiet cleaning lady who'd endured Webb's abuse for 8 months. This was Liz Rodriguez's daughter, and she was in her element. Colonel Rhodes arrived exactly on time, his presence commanding immediate attention. Elena studied him from a distance, noting the way he carried himself, the confidence of someone who'd seen combat, the slight favor of his left leg from an old wound, the way his eyes constantly scanned for threats. This was a man who understood the weight of life and death decisions. "Gentlemen," Rhodes' voice carried across the range without amplification. "Today we demonstrate why Fort Bennet produces the finest marksmen in the United States Army." Sergeant Webb stood at attention, chest puffed with pride. He'd selected his best shooters for the demonstration, confident that their performance would secure his promotion to staff sergeant. He had no idea that his greatest threat was sitting 400 yards away with a notebook and a silver dollar. The first shooter took position at the 600-yard line. Elena watched his setup through borrowed binoculars, immediately spotting the problems. "Cheek weld's too high," she whispered to Ramirez. "He's fighting the scope instead of working with it." The soldier fired 3 shots. 2 hit the outer rings, 1 missed completely. Elena winced as if she'd been physically struck. The second shooter attempted 800 yards. Elena watched him chamber 5 rounds, already knowing what would happen. "Scope's not properly zeroed for these conditions," she said quietly. "He's going to hit low and left." 5 shots later, only 1 had scored. Colonel Rhodes' jaw tightened with each miss, and Elena could see the disappointment building in his steel-gray eyes. During the ceasefire, she scribbled frantically in her notebook, recording not just the environmental factors, but the precise nature of each miss. Years of her father's training had taught her to see patterns where others saw only failure. "The wind's affecting them differently than they expect," she explained to Ramirez. "They're compensating for surface wind, but there's a thermal layer at about 500 yards that's pushing the bullets right. And they're not accounting for the mirage. It's creating the illusion of a different wind direction." Ramirez stared at her in amazement. "How can you possibly know all that from here?" Elena looked up from her notebook, and for the first time, he saw her father's legendary focus burning in her eyes. "Because I've been preparing for this my entire life, Lieutenant. I just didn't know it until now." As the demonstration continued to deteriorate, Elena felt a familiar calm settling over her. This was the moment her father had been preparing her for, not just to shoot accurately, but to step forward when others had failed, to honor the legacy he'd left in her hands. She stood up, brushing dust from her khaki pants, and checked her watch. The wind would be perfect in about 10 minutes during the next break in firing. The thermal inversion would stabilize, creating a brief window of ideal conditions. "Lieutenant," she said quietly, "it's time." Ramirez looked at her, seeing not the invisible contractor, but the daughter of a legend stepping into her destiny. "Are you sure about this?" Elena touched the silver dollar in her pocket, feeling its familiar weight. "My father used to say that being ready isn't about feeling confident. It's about being prepared to act when the moment demands it." She started walking toward the firing line, each step carrying her closer to a confrontation that would either vindicate 8 months of quiet endurance or destroy her forever. Behind her, Lieutenant Ramirez followed, knowing that he was about to witness something that would be talked about for decades. At the fence line, Elena paused and looked back at the range where she'd spent countless hours in silence. Then she turned toward the future, toward the moment when Liz Rodriguez's daughter would finally step out of the shadows. The demonstration was about to become something nobody had expected. Elena approached the firing line with steady steps, her heart hammering against her ribs but her breathing controlled. The Pentagon officials were checking their watches, defense. Contractors were packing up equipment, and Colonel Rhodes looked like a man watching his career prospects evaporate in the Arizona heat. Lieutenant Ramirez caught up with her just as Sergeant Webb noticed their approach. His face darkened when he saw Elena walking toward the demonstration area. "What's she doing here?" Webb demanded, stepping into their path. "I gave specific orders." "Stand down, Sergeant," Ramirez interrupted, his voice carrying new authority. "The young lady has a request for the colonel." Webb's eyes narrowed dangerously. "A request?" "She's a civilian contractor. She doesn't get to make requests during a classified demonstration." But Elena was already past him, walking directly toward Colonel Rhodes with the purposeful stride of someone who'd made an irrevocable decision. The range fell silent as conversation stopped mid-sentence, all attention focusing on the quiet woman who'd been invisible for 8 months. "Colonel Rhodes," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "I have a request, sir." Rhodes turned, his steel-gray eyes studying her with the intensity of someone who'd survived by reading people quickly and accurately. "And you are?" "Elena Rodriguez, sir. Civilian logistics contractor." She paused, then added quietly, "Daughter of Master Sergeant Luis Rodriguez." The name hit Rhodes like a physical blow. Elena watched recognition dawn in his eyes, followed by something that might have been pain, then respect. The entire firing line had gone dead silent, waiting to see how this unprecedented interruption would play out. "Luis Rodriguez," Rhodes said slowly. "Kandahar Province, 2003. "Yes, sir. You were a captain then." Rhodes nodded, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Your father saved my life and the lives of 11 other soldiers." "What's your request, Miss Rodriguez?" Elena felt the weight of every eye on the range, but her father's training held her steady. "Permission to attempt one demonstration shot, sir. I believe I can show what this range is truly capable of under current conditions." Sergeant Webb stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Sir, this is highly irregular. She's not qualified. What makes you think you can succeed where trained soldiers have struggled?" Rhodes interrupted, his question directed at Elena. Elena opened her notebook, showing pages covered with precise calculations and diagrams. "I've been studying this range for 8 months, sir. Every morning, recording atmospheric conditions, wind patterns, temperature variations. I understand the challenges here better than anyone present." Rhodes examined her notes, his eyebrows rising at the professional-grade ballistic calculations and meteorological observations. This wasn't the work of an amateur. This was the documentation of someone who'd been preparing for war. "Your father trained you?" "Every day from age 12 until he died when I was 16, sir." Elena's voice remained steady, but Ramirez heard the emotion underneath. "He taught me that precision matters more than recognition, and that excellence doesn't require an audience." Rhodes studied her for a long moment, seeing something in her posture that reminded him of her father. The same patient stillness, the same quiet confidence that had preceded an impossible shot 15 years ago. "What do you propose, Miss Rodriguez?" Without hesitation, Elena reached into her pocket and produced a $1 silver. 1,000 yards, sir. Single shot. But not at a paper target. She held up the coin, its surface catching the sunlight. "This belonged to my father. He used it to teach me about precision under pressure. I'd like you to throw it, and I'll split it with a rifle shot." The range erupted in murmurs. Pentagon officials stopped their conversations. Defense contractors turned back from their vehicles, and every soldier present stared at Elena as if she proposed to walk on water. "That's impossible," Webb sputtered. A moving target at 1,000 yards? In these conditions? It can't be done. Elena looked at him calmly. My father always said impossible just means no one has done it yet. Rhodes examined the silver dollar, noting its wear patterns and the way Elena handled it with obvious reverence. This wasn't a publicity stunt or a desperate grab for attention. This was a daughter trying to honor her father's memory, and the father's memory, and the father towards a daughter trying to honor her father's memory in the father's memory, as memory in the most meaningful way possible. If you miss, Rhodes said quietly, you'll have embarrassed yourself and this installation in front of the most senior military officials in the country. Yes, sir. I understand. And if you succeed? Elena's eyes met his with unflinching directness. Then maybe people will remember that excellence can come from unexpected places, and that my father's lessons didn't die with him. Rhodes looked around the range, taking in the failed targets, the disappointed officials, the soldiers who'd let him down. Then he looked back at Elena, seeing not a civilian contractor, but Luis Rodriguez's daughter, carrying her father's legacy in her steady hands. Lieutenant Ramirez, he said finally, select a rifle for Miss Rodriguez. Webb started to protest, but Rhodes cut him off with a look that could have frozen the desert. You had your chance, Sergeant. Now, we'll see what real preparation looks like. As Ramirez moved toward the weapons rack, Elena felt the familiar calm that had always preceded her father's most important shots. The noise of the crowd faded away, leaving only the whisper of wind across the range and the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. She was Luis Rodriguez's daughter, and she was about to prove it to the world. Lieutenant Ramirez selected a well-maintained Remington 700, checking the action and scope, mounting with the care of someone who understood that careers were about to be made or destroyed. He handed the rifle to Elena with a quiet, "Make your father proud." Elena accepted the weapon with the reverence of someone handling a sacred object. Her hands moved over it with practiced precision, function checking the bolt, examining the barrel crown, testing the trigger, pull with the unconscious expertise of someone who'd been raised with rifles as tools rather than weapons. What? Ammunition? Ramirez asked. Federal gold medal match, 168 grain Sierra Match King, if available. It was. Elena selected a single cartridge, examining it carefully in the sunlight before loading it into the chamber. The metallic click of the bolt closing echoed across the silent range like a bell tolling. Colonel Rhodes walked 30 yards forward, the silver dollar gleaming in his palm. The Pentagon officials had moved closer, their earlier departure forgotten. In the face of this unprecedented drama, defense contractors readied their cameras, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. Elena took her position at the 1,000-yard line, and something fundamental changed in her bearing. The quiet contractor disappeared, replaced by someone who'd inherited the shooting skills of a legend. The rifle became part of her body, an extension of her will focused on a single point in space. Are you ready, Miss Rodriguez? Rhodes called. Out. Ready, sir. Elena's breathing slowed to the measured rhythm her father had taught her. 4 counts in. Hold for 2. Squeeze during the natural respiratory pause. Her world narrowed to the scope picture, the wind indicators, the mathematical precision of ballistics and atmospheric conditions. Through her scope, she could see Rhodes clearly, his hand drawn back to throw. She'd calculated the trajectory, accounted for the wind, adjusted for the thermal inversion that had been plaguing the other shooters. Everything her father had taught her over 10 years of training condensed into this single moment. This throw will determine whether your father's training was worth 10 years of patience, Rhodes announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the range. Elena felt the familiar stillness that preceded perfection. Her finger rested on the trigger with the delicate touch of someone who'd fired 10,000 practice rounds. A silver dollar represented more than just a target. It was vindication, legacy, and the end of 8 months of being invisible. Rhodes drew back his arm. "Mark!" The coin spun upward, tumbling in the brilliant sunlight. 30 feet, 40 feet, beginning its graceful arc downward. Time seemed suspended, the entire world holding its breath as Elena's finger applied steady pressure to the trigger. The mathematics were perfect in her mind. Windage calculated to the 1/10 of a millimeter. Elevation adjusted for the 1,000-yard distance. Timing planned to intercept the coin at the apex of its arc. Her father's voice whispered in her memory. "When everything comes together, Mia, you don't aim at where the target is. You aim at where it's going to be." The trigger broke clean and smooth, sending the 168-grain bullet downrange at 2,650 feet per second. The rifle's recoil was absorbed by Elena's practiced stance, her eye never leaving the scope as she tracked the shot. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, the silver dollar continued its spin through the crystalline desert air. Then, impossibly, it seemed to hiccup in mid-flight, suddenly becoming 2 separate pieces tumbling in different directions. The range exploded in shocked silence, then erupted in cheers and applause. Pentagon officials were on their feet. Defense. Contractors were shouting into their phones. And soldiers who'd been dismissive of Elena moments before were staring at her with awe and disbelief. Colonel Rhodes stood in the middle of it all, holding the 2 halves of the silver dollar with something approaching reverence. The break was clean, perfectly centered, the kind of precision that spoke of not just skill but destiny. "Gentlemen," Rhodes said, his voice carrying over the celebration, "you have just witnessed something that will be talked about for the next 50 years. Elena set the rifle down carefully, tears streaming down her face, but her smile radiant. 8 months of invisible service, 10 years of carrying her father's legacy in silence, and a lifetime of preparation had led to this single, perfect moment. Sergeant Webb stood frozen in shock, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and the dawning realization that he'd been tormenting someone whose capabilities were beyond his comprehension. The soldiers who'd mocked her looked ashamed, understanding that they'd been judging a master by the standards of apprentices. Rhodes walked over to Elena, extending the 2 halves of the coin. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly. This was impossible by any reasonable standard. Elena wiped her eyes and accepted the broken coin. "You used to say that impossible just means unpracticed, sir." Rhodes removed his unit insignia and pinned it to Elena's shirt. "You don't represent this unit, Miss Rodriguez. This unit represents you." As the celebration continued around them, Lieutenant Ramirez approached Elena with something approaching awe. "How did you know you could make that shot?" Elena looked at the broken silver dollar, then at the range where she'd spent 8 months. "In patient preparation. I didn't know, Lieutenant. But my father taught me that being ready isn't about certainty. It's about having the skills and courage to act when the moment demands it." The shot that split the silver dollar had done more than demonstrate marksmanship. It had shattered assumptions, vindicated patience, and proved that excellence often comes from the most unexpected places. Fort Bennett would never underestimate the quiet observer again. The aftermath of Elena's shot spread through Fort Bennett like wildfire. Within hours, the story had reached every corner of the base, growing with each telling but never losing its essential truth. The invisible contractor had just pulled off the most impressive shot in the installation's history. Colonel Rhodes called an immediate meeting with his senior staff. Elena found herself sitting in the base commander's office, still wearing the unit insignia Rhodes had pinned to her shirt, the 2 halves of her father's silver dollar resting on the desk between them. "Miss Rodriguez," Rhodes began, his tone formal but respectful. "What happened today was extraordinary, but it also raises some serious questions about how we've been utilizing our personnel. Sergeant Webb shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The man who'd spent 8 months making Elena's life miserable now looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "I've been reviewing your treatment of Miss Rodriguez," Rhodes continued, his steel gray eyes fixed on Webb. "And I'm not impressed with what I found." Webb's face flushed. "Sir, I was just maintaining discipline and proper protocols. You were bullying a woman whose qualifications exceed those of half the soldiers on this base." Rhodes' voice cut through Webb's excuses like a blade. "You prevented her from contributing to the mission because of your own prejudices and insecurities." Elena watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. Not vindictive pleasure, but the deep contentment of someone who'd finally been vindicated after months of patient endurance. "Furthermore," Rhodes continued, "you directly disobeyed standing orders about utilizing all available expertise. Miss Rodriguez's knowledge of range conditions and atmospheric factors could have prevented today's embarrassment if you'd had the wisdom to listen to her." Lieutenant Ramirez spoke up. "Sir, I've reviewed Elena's maintenance logs and observations. Her documentation is more thorough than anything we've produced internally. She's been doing the work of a master sergeant while being treated like a janitor." Rhodes turned to Elena. "What would you like to see happen here, Miss Rodriguez?" Elena considered the question carefully. She could have demanded apologies, transfers, or formal disciplinary action. But that wasn't why she'd spent 10 years carrying her father's lessons. "I'd like to see Fort Bennett become a place where capability matters more than appearances," she said finally. "Where quiet contributors are valued alongside the loud ones. Where someone's potential isn't dismissed because they don't fit preconceived notions." Rhodes nodded approvingly. "Sergeant Webb, you're reassigned to administrative duties pending a full review of your conduct. Lieutenant Morrison will take over range operations." Webb's career ambitions crumbled visibly, but Elena felt no satisfaction in his downfall. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring that others wouldn't face the same dismissal and disrespect she'd endured. "Miss Rodriguez," Rhodes continued, "I'd like to offer you a position as our civilian marksmanship instructor. Your understanding of ballistics and range conditions is exceptional, and your father's training methods could benefit every soldier on this base." Elena shook her head gently. "Thank you, sir, but I need to decline." The room fell silent. Rhodes raised an eyebrow. "May I ask why?" Elena looked down at the broken silver dollar, then back up at the colonel. "For 8 months, I've been asking myself if I was good enough to honor my father's memory. Today answered that question, not because I made an impossible shot, but because I learned that excellence doesn't need recognition to have value." She stood, her voice gaining strength. "I came here to prove something to myself, and I did. But my father didn't train me to be comfortable in one place. He trained me to carry his lessons wherever they're needed most." Rhodes studied her with respect. "Where will you go?" "There are other places where quiet observers are underestimated, sir. Other people who need someone to believe in their potential." Elena smiled. "My father's legacy isn't meant to stay in one range. It's meant to spread." The meeting ended with handshakes and promises to stay in touch. But as Elena walked out of the commander's office, she carried with her something more valuable than any job offer: the knowledge that she'd proven herself worthy of the name Rodriguez. Meanwhile, word of the shot had already reached beyond Fort Bennett. Pentagon officials were making calls. Defense contractors were reviewing footage, and military installations across the country were hearing about the civilian who'd split a coin at 1,000 yards. Sergeant Webb cleared out his office that afternoon, his promotion dream shattered by his own prejudice. As he packed his belongings, he found himself thinking about all the times he'd dismissed Elena's suggestions, all the expertise he'd ignored because it came from someone he'd considered beneath notice. Lieutenant Ramirez, promoted to range commander. effective immediately, instituted new policies that very day. Every civilian contractor would receive cross-training opportunities. Every suggestion would be evaluated on merit, not source. Every person working on the range would be treated with the respect due to a professional. The Rodriguez Standard. He called it in his first memo to the troops. We judge people by their capabilities, not their appearances. We listen to expertise, wherever we find it. And we remember that the person we underestimate most might be the one who saves our mission. That evening, Elena sat in her apartment, packing the few belongings she'd accumulated during her 8 months at Fort Bennet. The broken silver dollar sat on her dresser next to her father's photograph, both pieces reflecting the lamplight. Like captured stars, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. Elena Rodriguez? The voice was professional, female, tinged with respect. Yes, this is Captain Jessica Martinez from the Army Marksmanship Unit. We heard about what happened today at Fort Bennet. We'd like to talk to you about some opportunities. Elena smiled. I'm listening. As the conversation continued, Elena realized that her shot had done more than vindicate her father's training. It had opened doors she'd never imagined, created possibilities she'd never considered. The quiet contractor, who'd been invisible for 8 months, was about to become very visible indeed. But first, she had one more task to complete at Fort Bennet. The next morning arrived gray and cool, unusual for Arizona, but perfect for Elena's final task at Fort Bennet. She arrived at the range at 5 a.m. as she had for 8 months, but this time she wasn't alone. Lieutenant Ramirez was waiting for her, along with a dozen soldiers who'd requested to be there. We wanted to see you off properly, Ramirez explained, and maybe learn something before you go. Elena smiled, touched by the gesture. These were some of the same soldiers who'd ignored or mocked her just days before, but now they looked at her with genuine respect and curiosity. What would you like to know? Private Jackson, the young soldier whose jammed rifle had led to her first confrontation with Webb, stepped forward nervously. Ma'am, how did you learn to read conditions so well? I've been shooting for 3 years, and I still struggle with wind calls. Elena set down her notebook and looked out over the range. It's not about the shooting, she said. It's about the watching. My father taught me that a marksman spends 90% of their time observing and 10% pulling the trigger. She opened her notebook, showing pages of meticulous observations. Every morning for 8 months, I've recorded conditions here. Temperature, humidity, wind speed and direction, mirage patterns. After a while, you start to see the patterns. She pointed to a notation from 3 months earlier. See this? On July 15th, the wind shifted from southeast to southwest at exactly 0847 hours. Same pattern happened July 29th, August 12th, August 26th. Every 2 weeks, like clockwork. When the temperature differential hit certain markers, the soldiers gathered around, amazed by the depth of her documentation. This wasn't casual observation. This was scientific study applied to the art of marksmanship. But the real lesson, Elena continued, isn't about wind or temperature. It's about patience. Excellence takes time to develop, and it usually happens when nobody's watching. She looked around at the faces surrounding her. Young soldiers hungry to improve. Seasoned NCOs who'd learned humility from watching her shot. Officers who were rethinking their assumptions about capability and appearance. My father used to say that the most dangerous assumption is that quiet people have nothing valuable to contribute. The second most dangerous assumption is that expertise always comes in expected packages. Sergeant Morrison, newly promoted to Webb's former position, spoke up. What advice would you give to someone taking over range operations? Elena considered the question. Listen more than you speak. Judge people by their actions over months. not their appearance in moments. And remember that the person who might save your unit could be the one you notice least. She pulled out a manila envelope and handed it to Ramirez. These are all my observations from the past 8 months. Wind patterns, temperature variations, optimal shooting windows for different times of day and year. Maybe they'll help future soldiers avoid some of the struggles we witnessed. Yesterday, Ramirez accepted the envelope with reverence. This is incredible work, Elena. Are you sure you won't reconsider staying? Elena shook her head. I have other ranges to study, other people to surprise. She smiled. Besides, Fort Bennett doesn't need Luis Rodriguez's daughter anymore. You've learned the real lesson, which is, excellence rarely comes in expected packages. The most valuable team members often contribute quietly, consistently, without seeking recognition. And the person you underestimate most might be the one who saves your mission. As Elena prepared to leave, Private Jackson approached her with something in his hand. Ma'am, we wanted you to have this. It was a custom challenge coin, hastily but beautifully made. On one side was the Fort Bennett logo. On the other, an engraved silver dollar split perfectly in half, with the inscription, Rodriguez Standard, Excellence in Silence. Elena felt tears spring to her eyes. Thank you. All of you. She walked to her old Honda Civic, the same unremarkable vehicle that had carried her to the base every morning for 8 months. As she drove away, she could see the soldiers in her rearview mirror, still standing at the range, watching her departure with the respect reserved for legends. 3 months later, Lieutenant Ramirez received a package with a Montana postmark. Inside was a business card for Precision Ballistics Consulting, with a return address for a company that specialized in training law enforcement and military snipers. The lead instructor was listed simply as E. Rodriguez. Attached was a note. Lieutenant, thank you for giving me the chance I've been preparing for without knowing it. The Rodriguez Standard is spreading. Last month, a quiet intern at a police academy in Denver proved she could outshoot veteran officers. 2 weeks ago, I overlooked corpsman in North Carolina demonstrated field medicine skills that saved 3 lives during a training accident. Excellence doesn't require an audience, but it deserves opportunity. Elena. Colonel Rhodes kept the 2 halves of the silver dollar in his office, mounted in a wooden frame with a simple inscription. The shot that proved impossible is just another word for unprepared. The story spread throughout the military faster than official reports. Within a year, it had become required reading at the Army War College, used as a case study in leadership and human potential. Military installations across the country instituted their own versions of the Rodriguez Standard, creating opportunities for overlooked personnel to demonstrate hidden capabilities. But the most important legacy wasn't written in policy manuals or training curricula. It was written in the changed perspectives of everyone who witnessed Elena's shot, everyone who heard the story, everyone who learned to look twice at the quiet person in the corner who might be carrying 10 years of preparation and the patience to wait for the right moment to prove it. Elena had come to Fort Bennett to honor her father's memory. She left having created a legacy that would outlast them both. The understanding that excellence often develops in silence, away from spotlights, in the hands of people who are underestimated, until the moment they take their shot. And when they do, the whole world listens. 5 years later, Elena Rodriguez had become a legend in her own right. Her consulting company trained precision marksmen for law enforcement agencies and military units across the country. But more importantly, she had created a network of instructors who shared her father's philosophy. Excellence doesn't require an audience, but it deserves opportunity. The Rodriguez Standard had evolved into a comprehensive approach to human resource development, used by organizations far beyond the military. Companies discovered hidden talents in overlooked employees. Schools found gifted students who'd been written off as average. Communities learned to value the quiet contributors who made everything work. Elena still carried her father's silver dollar, now welded back together with a thin line of gold marking where it had been split. It served as a reminder that even broken things could be made whole, that even invisible people could leave lasting marks on the world. Her father had taught her that precision matters more than recognition. Elena had learned that recognition, when it comes for the right reasons, could amplify precision's impact far beyond what any single person could achieve alone. The quiet woman who'd been invisible for 8 months had become a voice for every overlooked person carrying hidden potential. Her shot at Fort Bennett had lasted less than a second, but its echo would resonate for generations. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones you notice least, until they take their shot and change everything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.